This is me and my father, sometime around 1960, 61. I was, like 13, 14 years old, I think. We were at the Notorious River in Central Oregon, and that's Mount Jefferson on the horizon back there. I never became very interested in fly fishing or fly tying, and my dad never made me feel badly about that. He never made me feel like I was disappointing him, which I'm really grateful. The most important thing for him was that I learned to love nature. This is one of my father's trout flies. When he died, he left 750 flies for me. I have been starting to photograph them. I want to explain that there are different branches of fly tying. The one that most people hear about is salmon fly tying, partly because of this famous book, The Feather Thief, which was also an article in the New Yorker, I think, called The Feather Heist. And it was about a very high-profile burglary of priceless, irreplaceable feathers, mostly from jungle birds from Central and South America. But that is a very different kind of fly tying, and these flies are not imitating any natural creature, but they are effective for catching salmon and also for attracting collectors to spend money on them. On the right are streamers, which you're more likely to see in places like Lake Winnipesaukee or Squam Lake if people are fishing. The streamers imitate little minnows, little fish. And even though they're not representing a fly, they're still called fly tying. We call all of these fly tying. And on the right are some examples of saltwater flies, a shrimp and a crab. And they're, you name it, they're fly tying for imitating little squid and octopus and all kinds of little sea fish. But my father was not interested in any of that. He was interested in the flies that live in trout streams, which are cold water streams. You would not find them in Midwestern farmland where the water is too warm. A stream where my father and I were photographed was very cold water that came out of the base of Black Butte, which is in near Bend, Oregon, which is where the American Olympic ski team practices. On the upper left is a stonefly, down the middle is a mayfly, and in the upper right is a caddisfly. These are the three main insect foods that are eaten by trout. The first time my father took me to a trout stream, the most important thing he did at the beginning was not to have me catch a fish. The thing he started off with was to take me around to the grasses and the shrubs along the stream, and he taught me the names of these three insects. That was where it began. So here's an example. This is a mayfly called March Brown. You see mature adult mayfly in the bottom, and in the upper left is a nymph. The nymph version of the fly will live in the little gravel in the bottom of the trout stream for maybe 2 years, and then it will hatch, and it will live for 1 day maybe or 2 days, and often the mayfly doesn't even have mandibles to eat. It just lives long enough to reproduce. So they're sometimes called day flies, but they're very short-lived. And back before the atmosphere or the nature was filled with pesticides and loss of habitat, mayflies used to hatch in swarms that were like snowstorms. And bridges would be covered with piles of mayflies, and cars would skid off the road on the bodies of all these mayflies, back when the streams were healthy and they were full of these hatching insects. And one day in the Catskills on the Willowemic River, I was there with some of my friends who were fans of my father. Never met him, but they took me as a substitute to get to know my dad through me, which I loved being the person to play that role. And we stayed in a cabin by the water, and at night we would do fly tying at a table together. And we all have these little task lights which shine on the vise where the hook is, where we're doing the tying. And one night, couple of mayflies got into the cabin, and one of them was attracted to what looked like another mayfly on the ice, even though I hadn't finished tying it yet. But this is to just draw attention to the fact that this craft of the flies that you see on the wall here are little works of craftsmanship, fine craft, maybe you could call it multimedia art, that is a way of interpreting insects. And this is the Willowemoc River. This is a view looking down from Hazel Bridge. That's William Anderson in the foreground and Eric Kelly in the background, two of my best friends. But you see how beautiful it is. It's like sacred. You go to a trout stream, and for my father, and then for me and all the people we knew on the streams, it was like going into a kind of cathedral. Nobody talked about it that way, but there was always a sense of reverence, like, do not mess this up. This is so beautiful. And you would feel like enlarging from outside yourself when you got into a place of such great natural beauty. This is Eric, the same guy, on the east branch of the Delaware River, a little bit further west in the Catskills. It was a beautiful day with the water temperature was cold, so a little mist coming off of the water. Well, this is Jim Leisenring, who my father met when my dad was about 21 years old, during the Depression. He and his family were economic refugees from Ohio. They were living with affluent relatives in Doylestown, Pennsylvania, which is not too far from the Poconos. And Dad started to learn fly fishing and fly tying, and he heard about this Hotel Rapids on the Broadhead River in the Poconos. It's where he met this man, Jim Leisenring. And the day he met him, my dad said that my father had just learned how to tie the Royal Coachman, which is a very fancy fly that people love to look at. And he met Jim Leisenring, who had a creel full of fish, and he asked Jim if he could see the fly that he caught his last fish on. And Jim brought it out. It's a tiny little fly, and when you look at this is the fly here, the iron blue dun. And in the corner of my photographs, the fly is printed in actual size, 100%, the size of the actual fly that was tied in the vise. So Jim had this little fly on his fingertip, and my dad had never heard or seen anything like that. And he knew that he was in the presence of something unusual. And he developed a rapport, and the next year, Jim Leisenring invited him to his home in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. He worked as a toolmaker at the locomotive factory called Bethlehem Steel, which was right in the outskirts of Allentown. Now it's a casino, I think. But he was a German craftsman. He had learning disabilities, so he couldn't go to Lehigh University, which is where most of his family went. So he started off as a blacksmith and worked his way up. He was just a working man, with a foul mouth and a weird sense of humor, and he didn't know how to dress, and his teeth were all a mess, and he was like the best fisherman that anybody knew. He was incredible. So he offered to give lessons to my dad. When I was a little boy and I saw my dad's flies, I asked him, I said, why are some flies so pretty and others so plain? And he said, well, it's really simple. He says, some flies are designed to attract fishermen, other flies are designed to attract the trout. So my dad, before he met Leisenring, was taking lessons at Knoll's Tackle Shop, which was, I think, in Germantown or Doylestown, Pennsylvania. And of course, they had a Royal Coachman right there on the cover, because that was the fly instruction was aimed to enable you to learn how to tie. So my dad was, by all accounts, a prodigy at fly tying. Leisenring saw it. Another famous fly tyer named Reuben Cross, who had two famous books that came out in the 1940s and 30s. My dad was the best fly tyer that anybody knew, except for these masters. He asked Jim Leisenring if it would be okay if they produced a book that recreated, in between the covers of a book, the lessons that Leisenring gave to my father at his home the house that he shared with his mother and two sisters, because Leisering was a bachelor. He had no women friends, only hung out with guys. And Leisering agreed, and they produced this book in 1940. It's only like 80 pages, and it has become one of the classics of American fly tying literature. The first edition you can't get anymore. There was a later edition, which I'll show you, which came out in 1971, which if you're lucky you can find one for $70 or $100. And in it, Dad captured the lesson, which is very different from what he had been learning at Knowles, where they were teaching how to tie the Royal Coachman. So that's Leisering and my father looking at Jim Leisering's book. They call it a wallet. It has felt pages and it's got a leather cover. It's very soft. And because the feathers that make the hackle that goes around the hook are so soft, they're hen feathers, they're very soft, being pressed in the pages of a cloth book does not damage the flies. On dry flies with very stiff hackles it would, but these wet flies, they can take it. So there, my dad was the art director of this book as well as the editor and co-author, and he set up this portrait. It's now become one of the classic portraits of any American fly fisher. That's what Leisering looked like. This was him looking especially presentable when they got him dressed up for this. So after the book was published, the little hotel where my dad met Leisering, Hotel Rapids in Antelope, Pennsylvania, was run by a Frenchman and his wife, he was a French chef, and he was telling everybody about Jim Leisering. When my dad met him, he said, "You have to meet Jim Leisering. He is the best we have," and he told stories about him. He was called the Ty Cobb of fly fishing in Pennsylvania. And after the book came out, the owner of the hotel commissioned a portrait artist in Philadelphia to do this oil portrait of Leisering based on the frontispiece in the book that he and my dad made. And he had Jim tie a set of the flies that appear in the book and hung on the wall next to this portrait. Some years later, after Leisering had died and my dad had moved out to California and I was born, I was like a toddler, maybe middle school, and my dad wrote to Sports Illustrated and sold the idea, he pitched the idea to them of doing an article about Jim Leisering, this master of fly tying and fly fishing. And the editors of Sports Illustrated asked around and they found out that what my dad said was true. And they were running periodic articles. It was common in Sports Illustrated back in the 1950s and early 60s to run articles about fly fishing. So they asked my dad, they said, "Yes, we'll do that." And after they thought about it, they said, "Well, we think we're going to do 3 articles. We're going to do a series. And the first article is going to be about fly casting. The second article will be about stream strategy, how you get the fly in front of the fish so the fish will take it. And the third article will be about fly tying." And it was an amazing experience for my dad. They paid him a lot of money. He never was good at making money. He was a good fly tyer, but not a good money maker. And there's my dad, the illustrations by Anthony Ravielli's portrait of my dad with his vise in the section about fly tying. So now I'm going to start a little section about how this particular fly, March Brown nymph, is tied. The one in the photograph was tied by my father. All of these were tied by him. The ones in the step-by-step photo series were tied by somebody else. And you can see how much detail I get in the fly tying photography. This is the first time that trout flies have been able to be seen in this detail. And now there are some art historians who are thinking that these photographs of my dad's flies unlock the challenge of getting fly tying to be considered part of the canon of America's fine crafts. If you go to craft museums or look at fine craft magazines, fly tying is perhaps the only fine craft that goes back for centuries that is not accepted as part of the canon. And the reason is that they're too small to exhibit. That's changing now that we have photographs like this. These photographs can be enlarged to be 6 feet or 20 feet. The other problem is that they don't have any appreciable value. That even famous flies by famous fly tyers rarely sell for more than $500. They're not going to attract attention at auctions. But perhaps the biggest reason is that they were never tied for people. The critics that these were tied for were the trout. You know, they would take my dad would take the fly off of his vise, put it in his vest, take it to the stream and try it out, and he could tell if what the changes he made to it were effective or not. So all fly tyers are constantly refining the design of their flies based upon the reaction they get from the critics that they're most interested to impress. So this is Jim Slattery, who is one of the biggest fans of my father and has a big collection of my father's and Jim Weisenring's manuscripts. And he came and visited my wife and me in Merrimack, Massachusetts. On the left, he is down at Harvard's Houghton Library looking at the Pete Hidy fly tying collection down there. So we set up my camera and I photographed each stage. The first stage is to attach the thread to the hook. So this is silk thread, and that's the eye of the hook, the bend of the hook. This is the shaft of the hook, and this is the barb right here near the point. The next stage is to attach a feather. Different schools of thought among fly tyers on how to do this. And Weisenring and my father always attached the feather so that the shaft of the feather got tied on to the shaft of the hook, and the feather pointed out in the front over the eye of the hook. In this case, it's a partridge feather. Partridges are raised in special farms now for fly tying. These are poultry farms that produce these birds exclusively to sell the feathers to fly tyers. Most of the birds are hens, but there are some partridges. The next part is to attach these fibers from a cock pheasant feather. The feathers from the center part of the tail of a pheasant. Some of you have seen pheasants. They're not very common. They're an imported. They're not a native North American bird, but they're famous for sportsmen and hunting. And the fibers on the pheasant's tail were prized by fly tyers for purposes like this, to tie it on so it made the tail of the fly. And then fine gold wire was tied on that would later be wrapped around to make what is called a rib. And then another piece of thread was tied on, which has a use that you'll see in a moment. The next part was to create a fur rope, a little fur, what would be a fur body, they're called spun bodies. And the most popular fur for many flies came from the face of a hare, a wild rabbit. And the hair in different parts of the hare's face and ears and cheeks have different qualities of texture and darkness. So in the bottom left there is a sample that my dad made of spun bodies made with fur from different parts of the hare's face. Hare's cheek, hare's poll, hare's face, hare's ear, and he used this little spinning block that he would lay thread down, he would put the fur on the thread, he'd lay the strand of the thread back over it, and then spin it to make a little rope that captured the little fibers, and then he would lift it off and put it onto a card. And here is a very highly magnified view of how these fibers from the fur of the hare look when they're twisted into the silk thread. Spiky guard hair mixed with a fine underfur. So here is the spun body being tied onto the hook and then wrapped around the front part of the hook, which would be where the thicker part of the insect's body is. That's called the thorax. The part that's closer to the tail is called the abdomen. Then the next to final stage is to wrap the feather around the shank of the hook. And you do it very carefully, and be careful not to trap the fibers and have them all standing free of each other, forming a nice clean collar behind the eye of the hook. And then the final stage is to tie on a little head. Ties in the hackle and it creates a head of the insect. So there it is. This is the marsh brown nymph and the real thing. A lot of beginners think that doesn't look right. You know, why not make it look more like a real nymph? And there are some people who do that. They make flies that look like the actual insect. And when they fish with them, they never catch a thing. Because they don't act natural. The fibers don't move. It does, you know, it's all about the presentation and how the fibers behave underwater. So there's my dad, and this is a reprint in 1971 of the book that he and Jim Leisenring did in 1941. It has a section added called Fishing the Flymph. There was a centuries-old method of fishing that never had been given a name, and it was to imitate what the mayfly or the caddisfly looked like underwater when it was hatching, when it burst out of its nymphal exoskeleton, which would split open, and then like watching a butterfly come out of a cocoon. It's very similar. Then the insect would come out of the case and try and latch onto something, maybe go up through the water and go to a rock or a branch, and pump fluid into its wings, and its wings would unfold. You've all seen butterflies do that. But you fish that differently than if you were fishing a nymph imitation like this. Would be fished down in the gravel in the bottom of the stream. The emerging fly would be fished up under the surface. And Dad said, to avoid the confusion, let's give it a name, let's call it a flymph. It's a hybrid of fly and nymph. And a lot of people, there's something called scientific angling, which was really popular around the time my dad coined this word, and they laughed at it. But fly fishermen in general loved it, and now it has become part of the fly fishing lexicon. There was a book published by a fisherman in Sweden called Flympher, and flymphing is really popular all over, anywhere there are fly fishermen around the world now. One of the problems with the Leisenring book was that the photographs were terrible. Readers were writing to Leisenring and say, I can't make out what this fly is supposed to look like. Could you please tie me a set? And for a while, Leisenring was, you know, selling flies to readers, but it was too much. It was too much. He couldn't do very many of them. But that's what it looked like with the half-tone dots. You know, what can you tell from that? My dad tried photographing them. He put a little magnifying lens onto his Kodak Retina camera, and this was his attempt to photograph Leisenring's flies, but it was never very good. Maybe it was better than the halftones in the book, but not much. He gave up. Later on, in 2011, I decided I had a friend, Greg Mickus, who was here yesterday to help me hang the show, and who was the man who prints my photographs for me. He's a professional photographer, and he helped me start to learn how to do macro photography. So on the left is my first attempts at it back in 2011, which doesn't look too bad, right? And on the right is a new photograph. Here's the difference. This is what has gotten the attention of the art historians. There's one prominent art historian at Yale University who is a professor of American decorative arts. And I took these photographs down to show him, and he said that it was past time to have fly tying accepted as part of the canon of American fine crafts. So he's been a real encouragement to me to do things like having the show and to keep on photographing my dad's flies. These photographs are not me as an artist. These is really as a collaboration between my father and me. He could never do this photography. I could never do this fly tying. I magnetized a darning needle. You can buy these little devices at any hardware store, and you slide the needle in it and it magnetizes it. So I was able to hang the steel hook from the round tip of the darning needle. That's how I get the white background. I don't have it clamped on to any tweezers or anything. It's just hanging free. In the room where I was doing the photography, there were convection air currents because the temperature outside the windows was different from the temperature inside. And whenever you have that, or even if you have somebody breathing, whatever, it's going to cause these mild currents. And it takes like 7 seconds to go through taking a series of 80 or 150 photographs in this technique. There's software that I use that goes through the 150 photographs one at a time and masks out all of the blurry parts and only saves the sharp focused part of each photograph. And then it takes those sharp focused parts and combines them all into one single Photoshop file. And that gives a complete focus from the parts of the hackle that are closest to the lens and the parts of the hackle that are furthest away. And it gets this degree of definition that has never been seen in trout flies before. When I first get the photograph, the color is usually off. I have to edit it. I have to mask out the background to get it to go to pure white, and get rid of the darning needle and all of that. It can take another half a day to do the editing to get something that is okay to print. So this is one of my favorites of my dad's flies. This one hanging right here. It's called Hare's Ear Wet. He only used wings on flies while he was living in Pennsylvania. After the war was over and he got out of the Navy, he and my mother moved to the West Coast. I grew up in Oregon mostly. But all these flies that have wings were tied while he was still in Pennsylvania. And I've noted the date that I believe he tied the flies as close as I can on here. So some are tied after World War II and out in California and Oregon and Idaho. And the others were tied while he was living in Pennsylvania. When he was in Portland and the article in Sports Illustrated had just been published, he was a newcomer to Portland, and Portland had a great fly fishing community there. And it was especially popular among ranchers and also among wealthy white men, surgeons, CEOs, lawyers, judges. It was kind of a sport for affluent white men. And here's this article in Sports Illustrated, and they started saying, who the hell is this V.S. Hidy? He lives in Portland, and he's got an article in Sports Illustrated. We've never heard of him. So they invited him to start having lunch with him. And at one of the lunches, he said, you guys are great. You should have a fly fishing club, like the Anglers Club of New York. And my dad was a member of the Fly Fishing Club of New York, and he knew that it had this little journal on the left. And my dad's dream, he was a frustrated editor. His dream was to be an editor of a little fly fishing magazine. And he saw that getting a club started in Oregon could be his chance to start a magazine and also to hang out with these wonderful fly fishermen. So it all worked. Because these guys are judges and lawyers and CEOs, they know how to get things done. It took them 9 months to establish the club. They appointed my dad to be the first president. They started the magazine immediately with him as the editor. And my dad's friend at the Anglers Club, whose letters had helped coach the Oregon men on how to start a club. I have all the letters. They're incredibly funny and interesting. This man, Arnold Gingrich, he was a co-founder of Esquire magazine, which I'm sure you all heard of. And he was a friend of my father's, and he wrote about my father. And this little quote, it's an extract from a longer passage about my dad. As editor of the Creel, V.S. Hidy showed the way like a lantern in the dark, long before such journals as the Fly Fisher, Trout, Fly Fisherman magazine, and the American Fly Fisher, which is a scholarly journal published by the American Museum of Fly Fishing over in Manchester, Vermont, before they were ever dreamed of. He, Pete Hidy, is one of those rare spirits who could almost single-handedly give a sport a good name. A lot of people felt that way about him. He never said anything negative about anybody. I have letters that were written to him by other fly fishers where they were trashing the reputation of some other mutual fly fishing friend. And I would see the letters my dad wrote back. He never rose to the bait to say something bad about them. He was always the peacemaker. Here's all of the covers of the Creel. The top graphic designer in the Pacific Northwest, Doug Lynch, who was my dad's fishing partner, was the designer. I learned how to be a graphic designer by working in Doug Lynch's studio in Portland during my 2 college summers after freshman and sophomore years. And it really did attract attention. They were getting members from all over the world who would never be able to come to a meeting just because they wanted to subscribe and get copies of the magazine. And it did then spawn a new generation of beautiful magazines about fly fishing. One of them is Trout, which is the magazine of Trout Unlimited, the nonprofit organization that trout fishermen all over the United States belong to, and which is a major force in environmentalism. The current president, Chris Wood, helped make history last month when he published an editorial against a part of the Republicans' big, beautiful bill which involved selling public lands to private owners, selling off lands where a lot of these trout streams are, national forests, other public lands. He wrote a beautiful editorial in this magazine, and it inspired other editorials, and fly fishermen flooded their protests until the senator from Utah finally raised his hand and says, okay, I give up, I withdraw that part of the bill. So that's how powerful these fly fishermen through a magazine like this can be. And my father taught me to be an environmentalist. I belong to several environmental groups down in the area around Newburyport, Amesbury, Merrimack, Haverhill, and Kingston, New Hampshire. And one of the heroes of all of these groups is Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is today, I don't think anybody would argue that she is the most influential environmentalist alive today. Her book that came out in 2013 with a very small edition of maybe 2,000 copies has now approached 3 million sales, 20 foreign languages. It's been on the New York Times bestseller list since February of 2020, never was off of the list. And she was in this year's Time Magazine list of the 100 most influential people in the world. I contacted her 2 years ago to ask if I could publish this essay that is the main takeaway from her book, Raiding Sweetgrass, which is 400 pages long. It's a book of essays. But she decided to write this essay to sort of distill the most important idea from the big book. And I asked her if she would let me publish it, as long as I promised never to sell it. It would only be given away for free. And she said, yes, you go ahead and do that. So we got a verbal license from her to do it. We've given away 2,000 books. We ran out last month. We just printed 5,000 more. And I created this diagram that shows a contrast between sort of the European colonial Western view of man's dominion over nature, us being in this image of God, being the best, compared to the way indigenous cultures all over the world see themselves as having kinship with all other living creatures, all other plants and animals. Human, I put the human down there next to the jellyfish. And I put that circle up there because little homage to my father. This diagram is on page 3 of the little booklet, Help Yourself. And when you look at this diagram, and now you know the story about why this mayfly and this trout is in there, and how my dad's passion for the environment, for the beauty of the trout stream and the beauty of all nature carries on through fly fishermen and women all over the world today. So thank you so much for coming.